a red giant. But I do think reversing the heat death of the universe will be a little more difficult. So he didn't say no, which I thought was pretty cool. Anyway, so this man inspired me, and I thought, whenever something seems impossible, it's not, okay? It's never impossible, ever, until you're dead. And even then, if there are other people around, it's still not impossible, right? Until your last breath. So Bucky Fuller said this, and this is one of my personal mottos: you don't fight the existing reality. That's not how you change things. What you do is you build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that's really what we've been talking about for the last 2 days. So, what would a viable future look like? Well, it would be something that is organized in such a way as to meet the demands of surviving in our changing environment. And one of the prime features of all these systems that survive is they're adaptable. We've discussed that many times. What does that mean? Because somehow evolution isn't a smooth process, is it? No. The problem with evolution, as we heard from Martin yesterday, is that there are these things called crises. And you do a lot of forecasting and predictions and the best people and the best brains and models, and you get it completely wrong. And there are a lot of threats out there. And, perhaps that little blip thing is not just because of greedy bankers and consumers making a slight mistake or massive fraud, if you want to put it more bluntly. Maybe it's also a warning sign that we're hitting a limit in the system. When your heart, you look at the cardiogram, a very good heart is very flexible and adaptable, and it goes up and down, and it's regular. It doesn't suddenly do this and that, because that means you're dead. So this is a real warning sign. If you were a heart doctor, you'd be going, ooh, something there, we better take a look. Okay, there are a lot of people on the planet. I won't say too many. There's 7 billion people. They're there. We've got to look after them. There will be 9 by 2050. Question is, how are we going to make sure that they all have their basic needs met? That's number one. Number two, as Martin pointed out yesterday, civilizations go up and they go down. 1,000 years ago, who was the king? China and India. Who will be the king in 2050? China and India. We've had our first renaissance. Now there's a second renaissance coming. And it's not white. That was one thing I learned in South Africa at a young age. The future wasn't white. Being white, just because today you had like a little bit of power, and they called you boss or sir, didn't mean that the future was white. No, the future was brown. That's the color of our world. And of course, we've got this little problem that we're running out of land of all kinds, and our carbon footprint is possibly, I'm going to show you how, we can get down to 1.1 Earths. That's possible. Certainly if we head here, we're in deep, deep trouble. So let's move on. Where does all that growth come from? Well, we know where it's coming from, the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, Southern Africa. Economic growth certainly is and so a lot of scenarios that I've worked on in the past, in the last 20 years, for global corporations and banks and large organizations of all kinds, have had a scenario that looks like this. There's business as usual, and then there's a crisis, and then there's a collapse. Okay, that's the bad news. And we're seeing it around us. So how many people have noticed that the weather isn't quite what it used to be? Yeah? We've got 10 years of rare earth minerals left. The Chinese have bought most of them. What happens when you don't have all the cool stuff that we need to make iPhones and Galaxy, Samsungs and Nokias and everything else? Well, they're working on nanotechnology. They're praying. GE, all the big corporations have special programs to find replacements for rare earth minerals, because you can't make modern technology at the scale we're talking about without it. We also have 250 million people a year influenced, damaged by climate change. The big insurance companies we've had the decade of the most incredible damage, and insurance is going up. So I've met a lot of people, to be honest. I've met them. They're smart people. They have an interpretation, which is this. Okay. So they said, well, James Lovelock, read his latest book. What does he say in his latest book? He's written 3 books now. The Vanishing Face of Gaia. I don't remember the title of the last one, but it was very gloomy. He said, we'll be lucky to have 1 billion people by the end of the century because the Earth is just basically going to take over. It has to stay cool. You heat it up too much, it gets angry, it doesn't like it, and there are consequences. And he says there's nothing we can do. He says no matter what we think we can do, he's a pessimist. And, some days when you're sitting in front of your computer, evolution doesn't feel that. All those billions of years, and here we are, sitting in a box, eating from a box, typing into a box, and talking into a box, right? And then we're told to think out of the box. So, but that's very difficult when you're always in one, right? So, that's one interpretation. But I have some good news. As evolution works through crises. So, again, my good friend Elizabeth Sahtouris, the evolutionary biologist, says crisis is always opportunity. Even after every great extinction, why were there great extinctions? Because they were hugely successful creatures. The dinosaurs were massively successful. They lasted 50, 60 million years. We've only been around 50,000 as a species, really. But they were way too successful. And there was not enough oxygen left when the meteorite hit, and they died from lack of oxygen, right? Because they ate all the plants. They didn't know that. Nobody said, hey, look, guys, we're having a meeting in Rio. Don't eat so many plants, have less kids. Because they might still have been around, you never know. But luckily, we're here because they aren't. So that's the number one message. So our crisis is a birth. And Barbara Marx Hubbard has a lovely phrase here, which is, there is a profound birthing process underway on our planet, and the crises we face can be seen as contractions, birth contractions, and evolutionary drivers. These catalytic events are accelerating, which is really good news because it means the birth is near. So as a mother of 5 children, Barbara loves the idea that birth is painful. But what we're seeing is the birth of what she calls the species Homo universalis. We've gone through that phase 1 civilization. We're now heading into phase 0. We're heading into type 1 civilization. We're reaching for the stars. But to begin with, it's a very painful process, and it seems like the world's coming to an end to a lot of people. So there's the model that we've been working with for the last few decades to say, okay, we need a different model. We need a green growth model, not the traditional economic growth model. So let's look at a little bit about how we can implement that question of sustainability. So in doing scenario work, you obviously have some negative scenarios, and you also have what we call voluntary or spontaneous transformations, so that when you least expect it, something big happens and something shifts, and nothing's ever the same again. We had it in South Africa. I mean, one minute it was like, oh, well, everybody's getting arrested and tortured. The government's not moving. Nobody's doing anything. The blacks are rioting more and killing more people. They don't even care about us white people anymore, even if we're trying to help them. They don't care, because black power now versus the fascists. So what do? I left the country. Well, I can't have children in a country that's disintegrating. But it was a good lesson for me, because it's like the world today. The world feels like it's disintegrating sometimes. But we can't go. I can't go now on a spaceship and live on Mars. Even if it was more beautiful and so on. I mean, it's just not possible. So we have to voluntarily, spontaneously transform things. And that's what I've been working with. I've been working with a number of people who are working on what we call Vision 2050. So I'll tell you a bit about that. So here we are, 2012. And I'm going to kind of be telling you a bit of good news and bad news, right? That's the way stories are. You know how the messenger comes. Well, first, there's always the bad news. So what's the bad news? We've hit the limits to growth. We know that. Well, let's say most of us know that. Not everybody agrees, but I would say that The decision makers know that. The beauty is that we're not stuck in a growth model. The model we have in our heads of how economy should work, GDP, etc., it's a human fiction. We created it. Actually, there are a dozen other models, from the Global Happiness Index to, you name it, that not only do not make human happiness depend on consumption, but that show that human happiness goes much deeper than that. And the sort of things you have here in Estonia actually are kind of interesting, because a lot of the things you're doing are very aligned with that model of future success. So it's a very sustainable model that you have here. So the second bit of bad news is that, unfortunately, technology isn't the only, it's part of the solution, it's not the solution. The good news is that we've had a century of psychology, models of change, and an understanding of human evolution and development psychologically that means that we can shift things faster now and better and in a higher quality way than we ever could. So we have tools we never had before. They're not widespread in the population yet, because most people still, as you've noticed, most people still think they're right. And that's a characteristic of what we'd call first-tier consciousness, which is that, if I'm a green and you're an executive in an oil company, then the oil company executive thinks he's right, the green person thinks they're right. And then what they do is they reach something called compromise, which is just a messy process. They don't align, there's no synthesis. But what we're getting to is a form of consciousness, which I'll explain later, where the human being is able to transcend all those different worldviews and see that their worldview is just one of many worldviews, and then they create a space in which new things can emerge. Okay, so we're going to have to adapt to mega changes. St. Petersburg is ready for 2 meters level sea rise. Yeah? London is ready for about 2 meters. The problem is, with a 4-degree scenario, it's not 2 meters sea rise. But okay, we've got another maybe 40 years to build another 2 meters on top of that. But what do? We keep on going? It's 30 meters if we lose Greenland and West Antarctic. That's not both ice caps, it's just Greenland and the West Antarctic. Okay, fantastic news. This is the biggest business opportunity of all time. $250 billion went into renewable investment last year, and it's just beginning. The ethical investment market has taken off like that. I know people who are putting billions into that market. It's still not enough, but it's a start. Ethical companies outperform unethical companies, by the way, in terms of not just profit, but every other measure, social responsibility, environmental credentials, and so on. So the bad news is we've got 10 years to get our act together. We're at a tipping point. The good news is, guess what? When there's a major crisis, we can respond as a species. Look at the last century. We've had major world wars. Okay, the Second World War was a pretty messy affair for most people involved. But look at what came out of that. All the technology, we took people to the moon. The Cold War, hey, why was there an American on the moon in 1969? Well, because the Americans were paranoid that the Russians were going to get there first. I'm not sure how that's helped us, but I think it is a step towards the stars. The final piece of bad news is this is going to impact our societies very badly. I was watching the Ukrainians putting tents up all over Ukraine for the homeless people because they're freezing to death. And they've got little gas heaters in there and they're giving them clothes. But I mean, it's not the climate's global warming, it's not warming, it's climate change. It's extremes. So our social impact is terrible, especially on the elderly. But the good news is that we're learning how to empower people to look after themselves, how to shift cultures and our psychology, and even big corporations. So let's talk a little bit about some of the understandings that we can help us. Because evolution itself is evolving, and that's very exciting. We're at the leading edge of that evolution right now in this room, all of us. As you've heard, Charles Darwin, you've heard this a few times now, came up with this idea called the theory of evolution. And it was because the UK was running out of food in 1840. And the economist Thomas Malthus, gloomily, probably at a conference like this, got up and said, "We're running out of food. There's too many people. Oh, shit. We're going to have some..."